Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Matt broke into the hospital, said 3 words before stabbing Nick. The young and the restless explodes into absolute chaos as the night that was supposed to mark Nick Newman's slow recovery instead becomes one of the darkest, most blood-soaked turning points Genoa City has ever witnessed, because in a single, breathless stretch of terror, Matt emerges from the shadows like a ghost resurrected by hatred, infiltrates the hospital with chilling precision, locks eyes with Nick as machines beep helplessly in the background, whispers 3 devastating words that will echo through every Newman heart forever, and then plunges the knife down with savage intent, shattering lives in one horrifying instant as everything the Newmans thought they had secured slips through their fingers, because this wasn't just an attack. It was a message, a declaration of war, and a confession all rolled into one, beginning hours earlier, when the hospital corridors were deceptively calm, the fluorescent lights humming softly as Nicky sat at Nick's bedside gripping his hand, exhausted but relieved after days of uncertainty, whispering promises about family dinners, second chances, and how Victor would never stop fighting for him. While outside the room, Victor himself paced like a caged lion, haunted by the sense that danger never truly leaves, not for a Newman, not when enemies like Matt are still breathing, and that instinct, that gut-level dread Victor has trusted for decades, was screaming at him even as security reassured him the building was locked down, guards posted, cameras active, because what Victor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Matt had already been inside for over an hour, wearing scrubs stolen from an unconscious orderly, his face partially obscured, his movements rehearsed and deliberate, every step fueled by months of obsession, resentment, and a twisted sense of destiny that told him tonight was the night everything would be settled, because to Matt, Nick wasn't just a victim, he was the symbol of everything Matt believed had been stolen from him: power, respect, control, and the twisted belief that the Newmans always survive while everyone else bleeds. And as Matt moved through stairwells and service corridors, memories flashed through his mind like a deranged highlight reel. Victor's cold stare, Nick's defiance, Nicky's tears, all of it feeding the fire until he finally reached Nick's floor, timing his approach perfectly as a nurse was called away by a staged emergency, leaving Nick's room momentarily unguarded, and that was when fate tilted, because Nicky chose that exact moment to step out to get coffee, whispering she'd be right back, brushing Nick's hair back with a smile that was meant to be reassuring but would soon haunt her forever. And as the door slid shut behind her, Matt stepped out of the shadows and into Nick's room, closing the door silently, his presence sensed before it was seen as Nick's eyes snapped open, instincts sharpened by years of surviving violence, his heart monitor spiking as he recognized the man standing at the foot of his bed, and for a split-second time seemed to freeze, the hum of machines loud in the silence, Nick's voice hoarse but defiant as he demanded to know what Matt was doing there, security surely on the way, telling him to leave before things got worse, but Matt only smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that carried no humor, no mercy, just certainty. Stepping closer as he pulled the knife from beneath his scrubs, the blade catching the light like a promise of pain, and Nick, weakened but unbroken, tried to reach for the call button, only for Matt to slam his hand down on the bed rail, leaning in close enough for Nick to smell the antiseptic mixed with sweat and rage. And that was when Matt whispered the 3 words that would later be replayed again and again in everyone's mind, 3 words so loaded they felt like a curse. Victor chose you. Those words hit harder than the blade ever could, because in that instant Nick understood this wasn't random, this wasn't just revenge, this was about Victor, about favoritism, about a lifetime of perceived betrayals, and before Nick could respond, before he could even process the full meaning, Matt raised the knife and stabbed him, the sound of flesh being pierced drowned out by the shrill alarm of the heart monitor as Nick cried out in pain, blood blooming across the white sheets like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion, Matt driving the blade down with terrifying force, snarling about how this was supposed to happen, how the Newmans always think they win, how Victor made his choice years ago and now Nick would pay the price, and just as suddenly as it began, chaos erupted outside the room as Nicky dropped her coffee, the cup shattering on the floor as she heard her son scream, her heart stopping as she ran toward the sound. Pounding on the door as Matt yanked the knife free. Blood dripping onto the floor, his eyes locking with Nick's one last time, cold and resolved, before he slipped past Nikki in the doorway, knocking her aside as she collapsed to the floor screaming Nick's name. Victor hearing that scream from down the hall and sprinting toward it with a roar of pure terror. Security finally flooding the corridor, too late to stop the damage. Too late to prevent the image that would burn itself into Victor's soul forever. His son bleeding out, Nikki hysterical, and the realization that his worst fear had come true, because despite all his power, all his money, all his precautions, someone had still gotten through, and as doctors rushed in, shouting orders, trying to stabilize Nick as he slipped in and out of consciousness, Victor stood frozen, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, haunted by Matt's words as Nikki repeated them through sobs. Victor chose you. The phrase cutting deeper than any accusation ever had, because Victor knew, in that moment, that Matt hadn't just stabbed Nick. He'd stabbed the entire Newman family right in the heart, exposing old wounds, rivalries, and regrets that had never truly healed. And as the episode barrels forward, the aftermath becomes just as explosive as the attack itself, with Victor unleashing a furious manhunt for Matt, vowing that this time there would be no deals, no mercy, no second chances. While Nikki sits by Nick's bedside praying for a miracle, blaming herself for leaving the room, replaying that moment over and over until it feels unbearable, and Nick, drifting between consciousness and darkness, hears fragments of voices, sees flashes of faces, and wonders if this is how it ends, thinking of Sharon, of his children, of all the things left unsaid, while elsewhere Matt runs through the night, sirens blaring behind him, convinced he's finally even the score, unaware that his 3 words have set off a chain reaction that will change everything, because when Nick finally stabilizes, but remains in critical condition, the question shifts from whether he will survive to what will happen when he wakes up and fully remembers those words, because Victor chose you isn't just an explanation, it's an accusation, one that threatens to tear apart the fragile balance between Nick and his siblings, to force Victor to confront the consequences of decades of choices, and to push the story into even darker territory as Genoa City braces for the fallout of a hospital stabbing that proves once again that in the young and the restless, love and loyalty are never simple, enemies never truly disappear, and sometimes 3 words can be more devastating than a knife. And the nightmare only deepens from there, because the hours following the stabbing stretch into an agonizing eternity where time seems to bend under the weight of fear, guilt, and fury, as Nick is rushed into emergency surgery, the doors of the operating room slamming shut like a verdict, leaving Nikki sobbing in Victor's arms while he stands rigid, eyes burning, already replaying every decision he's ever made that could have led to this moment, every enemy he underestimated, every warning sign he ignored, because for Victor Newman, power has always been a shield, but tonight that shield shattered, and the realization that his son almost died because of a vendetta aimed at him is a truth he can barely contain, and as surgeons work frantically to stop the bleeding, to repair the damage caused by Matt's blade, whispers ripple through the hospital, staff murmuring about the attacker who slipped through security, about how someone that dangerous could have gotten so close to a Newman. And those whispers follow Victor down the hallway as he storms into the security office demanding answers, his voice a low thunder as he promises consequences that will be swift and brutal, while Nikki remains behind, refusing to leave Nick's side even though she's barred from the operating room, clutching a blood-stained corner of his sheet like a lifeline, blaming herself for every second she stepped away, for every instinct she ignored, her mind haunted by the image of Matt's eyes and the sound of Nick's scream, and when Sharon arrives after getting the call, her face drains of color as Nikki tells her what happened, repeating those 3 words again. Victor chose you. And Sharon feels a chill run through her because she understands immediately how deeply those words will cut Nick if he survives, how they strike at the core of his lifelong struggle to define himself outside of Victor's shadow. And as dawn begins to creep through the hospital windows, painting the sterile halls in pale light, the tension only grows, because there's still no word on Nick's condition, and Victor's rage is metastasizing into something colder, more dangerous, as he starts making calls, mobilizing contacts, pulling strings that haven't been touched in years, because this is no longer about justice, it's about retribution, and somewhere across town, Matt hides in an abandoned warehouse, hands still shaking, blood not entirely washed from his skin, replaying the moment over and over. The look on Nick's face when he said those words, convincing himself that he finally spoke the truth out loud, that he finally made Victor feel the pain he's inflicted on others for decades, even as doubt creeps in around the edges, because part of him knows this won't end the way he imagined, that the Newmans never let go, and back at the hospital, the doctors finally emerge, their expressions guarded but hopeful, announcing that Nick made it through surgery, but remains in critical condition. The knife narrowly missing his heart but causing severe internal damage, and Nikki collapses in relief, gratitude and terror tangling together as she thanks every higher power she can think of, while Victor exhales a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his relief immediately hardening into resolve, because surviving means Nick can talk, Nick can remember, and Nick can help them destroy Matt, and when Nick is moved to the ICU, sedated and pale, machines doing part of the work his body can't yet manage, the family gathers around him, a silent vigil broken only by the steady beep of the monitors, and as the hours pass, cracks begin to form, because Victoria arrives and overhears the story, hears Matt's words, and something shifts in her expression, a flicker of old resentment surfacing as she wonders what Matt meant, whether there's some truth buried in that accusation, whether Victor really did choose Nick in ways that left scars on the rest of them, and Adam, hearing the same words later, almost laughs bitterly because to him, the idea that Victor chose Nick feels painfully ironic, given his own lifelong battle for acceptance, and suddenly Matt's 3 words are no longer just the ramblings of a madman, they're a catalyst, stirring up decades of unresolved family wounds, and Victor senses it, senses the undercurrent of judgment in the room, the unspoken questions, and for the first time in a long while, he feels exposed, because no amount of money can silence what's already been planted in their minds, and as Nick begins to stir days later, drifting toward consciousness, his first moments awake are disorienting flashes of pain and memory, the sterile smell of the hospital blending with the metallic scent of blood, Matt's face looming in his mind, those words echoing like a chant, "Victor chose you." And when his eyes finally open, Nikki is there instantly, tears streaming as she tells him he's safe, that the doctors say he's strong, that he's scared them all half to death, and Nick tries to speak, his voice weak, asking if it was real, if Matt was really there, and when Victor steps forward, guilt etched into every line of his face, Nick's gaze locks onto his father's, searching, questioning, and though he doesn't say it yet, Victor knows the question is coming, because those words demand an answer, and as news of the attack spreads through Genoa City, alliances shift, old enemies re-emerge, and everyone wonders how far Victor will go this time, because a hospital stabbing crosses lines even in a town accustomed to violence, and the police investigation heats up, uncovering how Matt manipulated schedules, exploited weaknesses, and how close the Newmans came to losing Nick forever, while Victor quietly takes matters into his own hands, pushing the investigation in directions the law won't go, and Nikki, watching this familiar pattern unfold, fears what it will cost them all, because vengeance has a way of spiraling, and Nick, trapped in his hospital bed, becomes the emotional epicenter of it all, forced to confront not just his brush with death, but the meaning behind Matt's words, questioning his relationship with Victor, his role in the family, and whether being chosen has always been a blessing or a curse, and when he finally asks Victor directly what Matt meant, the room goes silent, the weight of generations pressing down as Victor struggles to answer honestly, to admit mistakes without justifying them, knowing that whatever he says could either begin to heal old wounds or tear them wide open, and as this storyline surges forward, it becomes clear that the stabbing wasn't the climax but the spark, igniting a firestorm of emotional reckoning, moral ambiguity, and relentless consequences, because Matt's 3 words have done what knives alone cannot. They've forced the Newmans to look at themselves, to confront the cost of power, and to realize that survival doesn't always mean victory, especially when the deepest wounds are the ones that can't be stitched closed. And even as Nick's body begins the slow, fragile process of healing, the psychological damage spreads like a silent infection, because survival does not bring peace in Genoa City. It only opens the door to harder truths, and in the days following Nick's awakening, the hospital room becomes a revolving door of family members, each carrying their own interpretation of Matt's 3 words, each projecting their own history onto Nick's pale, recovering face, and Nick feels it immediately, that subtle shift in the air when Victor enters the room, the way conversations stop, the way everyone seems to be waiting for something explosive to be said, and though Nick tries to focus on breathing through the pain, on the simple miracle of being alive, his mind keeps circling back to that moment in the darkened room when Matt leaned in and whispered, "Victor chose you." Because it wasn't said with anger alone, it was said with certainty, like a truth Matt had been nursing for years, and Nick can't shake the feeling that the words were never really meant for him at all, but for Victor, a final accusation delivered through blood, and as the doctors encourage Nick to rest, to avoid stress, Victor finds himself banned from saying everything he needs to say, forced into silence for perhaps the first time in his life, because how does a man like Victor Newman admit that some of the worst damage he's caused wasn't intentional, but still real, and while Victor struggles, the city outside, the hospital seethes, because Matt is still at large, and every hour he remains free feels like an insult, like a ticking clock counting down to the next catastrophe, and Victor's private investigators close in, piecing together Matt's movements, uncovering a trail of obsession that makes it clear this attack was never impulsive, never about opportunity, but about symbolism, about striking Victor where it would hurt the most. And Nikki, torn between gratitude that Nick lived and terror of what comes next, begins to see the pattern too clearly, recognizing that violence has always followed the Newmans like a shadow, and that Matt is simply the latest embodiment of consequences long delayed. And when Sharon sits alone with Nick one afternoon, holding his hand as the machines hum softly, he finally speaks the words he's been avoiding, admitting that part of him wonders if Matt was right, if his life has been shaped by Victor's choices in ways he never fully acknowledged, if being chosen meant being molded, controlled, protected at the cost of independence. And Sharon listens, heartbreaking, because she knows Nick's strength has always come from pushing back against Victor, not from standing beneath him, and she gently reminds him that no one forced Victor to make the choices he did, and no one forced Matt to turn those choices into violence. And yet even her reassurance can't completely quiet the storm inside Nick, because trauma has a way of warping memory, and every time he closes his eyes, he feels the knife again, hears those words again, and wonders if this attack was the universe's brutal way of forcing him to confront something he's been avoiding his whole life. And as Victor finally tracks Matt to the outskirts of town, the confrontation that follows is anything but clean, because Matt isn't hiding in fear, he's waiting, convinced that Victor will come personally. And when they finally face each other, the air crackles with years of unspoken resentment. Matt accusing Victor of playing God with people's lives, of choosing winners and losers without mercy, of believing that power absolves him of responsibility, while Victor, for all his fury, finds himself unsettled by how clearly Matt articulates the damage, because there's truth mixed into the madness, and though Victor would never admit it aloud, he recognizes the cost of his legacy staring back at him through Matt's unhinged eyes, and when authorities finally intervene before Victor can cross a line he can't return from, Matt is arrested, screaming that the damage is already done, that even if Nick survives, the words will live on, and in a way, he's right, because back at the hospital, Nick senses the shift the moment Victor returns, the weight in his father's steps heavier than before, and when Victor finally sits beside Nick and speaks honestly, admitting that he's made mistakes, that he's favored, pushed, and manipulated in the name of family strength, but never intended harm, the confession lands awkwardly, imperfect and raw, and Nick realizes that healing won't come from answers alone, but from redefining his relationship with Victor entirely. And as weeks pass and Nick is finally discharged, stepping into the sunlight like someone reborn, The scars he carries are both visible and invisible, and Genoa City watches closely. Because everyone knows this story isn't really about a stabbing anymore, it's about reckoning, about whether the Newmans can evolve or whether history will keep repeating itself. And as Nick walks away from the hospital with his family beside him, he understands one final truth with startling clarity. Matt's 3 words were meant to destroy him, but instead they've given him a choice of his own, to keep living in Victor's shadow, or to step out of it and finally choose himself, and in the young and the restless. That kind of choice is the most dangerous twist of all.